So Randal Rauser, I want to thank you very much for joining me today. And this is a bit of a conversation, but I started seeing your YouTube videos and I thought you had some really interesting things to say. And we're talking about a lot of the same stuff, but we have kind of different approaches. And I've now read, I think, like most of two of your books, and I've heard a ton of your interviews. And I thought it would be really valuable to have a conversation with you about, among other things, conservative and liberal Christianity, evangelicalism and its future, maybe the question of staying Christian, apologetics. There's a lot of things that we could talk about, and I'm hoping we can just kind of start and see where we go. But maybe I can kind of introduce myself to you, and then you can kind of introduce yourself to me, if that's okay, because this is sort of just where we're just getting to know each other. So
sure,
yeah. So my name is Chris CJ. I go by online. I did a Master of Divinity. Well, let's go a little further back. I was raised in a Plymouth Brethren church in Canada. Very, very conservative, very evangelical, very fundamentalist. And I spent a lot of my life there, went away to university, ended up in a Pentecostal church for a while, ended up in a Baptist church for a while, kind of did the generic, like floating around roughly evangelical traditions until I found my home. But when I was 21, I was, the Baptist church I was attending tagged me to be their youth pastor. So I spent 10 years as a youth pastor in the Baptist church here in Ontario. And then I at the time, I think for a while I thought it was a mistake, but I'm really happy with it in retrospect. But I made the decision to go to seminary. So I attended a little Anglican seminary at the University of Western Ontario, which is here in London, Ontario. And I did a Master of Divinity there. And during that time, for lack of a better word, I would say I lost my faith. Did a Master of Arts after that, and eventually did a PhD in Christian origins. Now, I have since come back to faith, and I identify as a kind of liberal Christian, I guess, using that not in terms of like the modern liberal conservative divide, but more like the theologically liberal Christian of the kind of mid 1900s. And I make YouTube videos where I talk about leaving Christianity, staying in Christianity, and a lot of stuff about Christian origins in the New Testament, which is kind of where my expertise is. So that's a little bit about me. Do you mind kind of telling me a bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. So I was born in Edmonton, Alberta, where I live now, but grew up in British Columbia and Pentecostal, never spoke in tongues. Eventually, I would say like Evangelical is sort of describes the ethos. So dispensational. I mean, I remember debating like whether you could be mid or post-trib, or whether you had to be pre-trib.
That was the hot topic back then.
Yeah. And sort of realized that these were debates that were part of a subculture that only began to exist in the mid to late 19th century. Was a bit of a shock, for example, let alone Pentecostalism rising in the early 20th century. But yeah, I never spoke in tongues. Eventually I went to Christian University, Trinity Western, and Regent College in the 90s. Started going to a Baptist church in 95 or 96. Did my PhD in England, King's College, University of London, with a theologian named Colin Gunton. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, that was like the place to be in England for systematic theology. It was a great womb to develop some of my theological ideas. So a lot of leading theologians like Steve Holmes, John Zazoulis, Paul Helm, a lot of others, like leading academics in the field, were regular attendees to the weekly seminar. So that was a really formative experience. And then I went and taught a year at Briarcrest in Caronport, Saskatchewan, and then came to Edmonton, where I taught at a seminary for 20 years, and then left that a couple of years ago. I'd been working part-time as a workplace investigator as well since 2019, and I've gone into that full-time. So that's what I do now for my day job, with a special focus on doing investigations into religious organizations, churches that bring us in for issues like harassment, sexual harassment, etc. And then I've also written published 17 books, I think 3 of which were co-edited or co-authored, but I have another one coming out probably this fall on how to be evangelical and gay affirming. And so that's the one where my headspace currently is.
That's cool. I think I think probably the first place that I saw you, I was making these response videos to Wes Huff, and I guess the algorithm decided I wanted to, see people talk about Wes Huff, and I got a few of your responses too. And that led me down kind of into some of your videos where you talk about Christian apologetics. I eventually landed on a book you wrote in response to, is it Elisa Childers, who basically wrote a book saying that progressive Christians aren't Christians, and you wrote a very thoughtful and kind response to that. And then I spent a little bit of time reading your most recent book. It was the most recent one on Kindle that came up, like when I looked on Kindle. But
okay, so
anyway,
it's not the satire of fundamentalism.
no,
It's the Doubter's Creed that came out a couple years ago.
maybe that was it. I forget. Anyways, I'm sorry. I should have this in front of me, but I was hoping we could do this more of an interview of a conversation, so I didn't like line up everything like I know. Sorry, reverse that. Hoping it could be a conversation. Anyway, I think the thing that struck me about I found you're wrestling with a lot of the same stuff I wrestled with. I think we come from different angles. Like, I was trained as a Bible scholar. My theology is a little bit weak. I did have some moments it's funny because when I went into seminary, I had a really good theology professor, and I really did fall in love with theology for a little while. He was an expert in Karl Barth, so I ended up taking a full course in Karl Barth, and that meant like reading almost the entire, not the entire thing, but almost the entire church dogmatics. So I had spent a lot of time there, and I wanted to do an MA initially on Rudolf Otto's The Idea of the Holy, and I think it was because I was a struggling evangelical wanting to push back against these like liberals and hoping that like around the idea of holiness I could find some kind of theological traction. And then somewhere along the way I just kind of shifted to history and got really fascinated in the New Testament era and kind of never looked back, and that's where I did my PhD too. But so I mean, we have these different backgrounds, but I think we're wrestling with a lot of the same stuff. Where would you consider yourself now? Do you still use the word evangelical? I take it because you already said your next book is kind of about being evangelical. I know that's maybe a problematic label, as is liberal Christian, but do you want to talk a little bit about kind of your faith, like where you landed? Or
I mean, I did a debate back during the first Trump term, defending still being an evangelical against Frankie Schaeffer, who was saying we have to get rid of evangelicalism. I would say I'm pretty ambivalent about the label.
Yeah.
I do identify, let's say, with Methodist abolitionists of the early 19th century. I kind of like that era of evangelicalism. I'm much less sanguine about Carl Henry evangelicalism, and especially about post-1980 evangelicalism, where it's, at least in America, been melded with the Republican Party, and least of all wanting to be affiliated with MAGA evangelicalism, which has become the dominant brand in the U.S. in the last 10 years. I mean, not only the historic anti-science stance, but anti-vax conspiracy, the most egregious hypocrisy, and othering and demonizing outsiders, immigrants, things like that. It's just not a good picture. So I would say, like, when I talk about evangelicalism, insofar as I identify with it, it would be in the sort of historic Bebbington view of evangelicalism is centered on these four different emphases, like conversion, Christ, scripture, and activism. I would go that far for sure.
I guess it's sort of like I never used the word evangelical until I left, and then I used it as a catch-all for what I had come from. And I think like it sort of makes some sense as, I guess, what anthropologists would call an etic term, but it's not necessarily one we use emically. It's not necessarily one people inside the community use. We normally think of ourselves as a certain denomination or set of beliefs or something.
I would say that, in my estimation, that's changing. Like, certainly the denominational identification, in my experience, is really falling out of the background. So, for example, at the church I'm a part of, it was historically known as a Baptist church. Well, there was there was a merger about 10 years ago with another church, which was also Baptist, but in the process they dropped the name Baptist, so now it's just community, right? And that's and the fact is, like, most people, in my experience, end up going to a church because they like the music or whatever, they like the programming, not because it's denominational affiliation. That's different, of course, with Catholics, but that's what I see, at least among low church, non-mainline Protestants.
Is there a bit of a dissolving over, like you mentioned, pre-trib, post-trib, like this was the stuff that split churches 30, 40 years ago, and I don't even know if people know the difference anymore. Is that fair? Like there's a bit of a dissolving of some of those denominational, quote unquote, distinctives?
Well, things are always changing. So one of the points I make in my forthcoming book on being gay affirming and evangelical is just to point out how much evangelicalism has changed in 40 years that people don't recognize, how theological views that were once considered verboten are now accepted increasingly in the mainstream. So just a practical example, you couldn't be an annihilationist and an evangelical 40 years ago, and yet my last two pastors were annihilationists. It's just sort of become mainstream. And there's always a shifting going on like that. So with dispensationalism, I don't know, it's still significant in some areas. If you look at the degree of fidelity that a lot of evangelicals in the U.S. have toward Israel, I think that's very much linked to a dispensational theology. Yeah. But yeah, I don't know how much like the Tim LaHaye brand or the Hal Lindsey brand I grew up with in the 70s and 80s is still a thing.
That's interesting. And I think, one of the things, I'm often making videos where I use the word evangelical, and it's because people kind of know what I mean. But at the same time, it's like you're right. I left maybe 15 years ago now. I left and stopped considering myself a quote unquote evangelical. But even my evangelical family looked very different from what I grew up with. There's a kind of a constant evolution, which I guess there would be anyway in any human group, right?
So I just give an example. So because I'm writing that book, I'm in that headspace. So I give three different evangelicals. An evangelical from 1967. There's just like imaginary, but they could definitely be a person. So an evangelical from 1967 is appalled at the Loving v. Virginia decision of the Supreme Court that overturned the prohibition against interracial marriage. Because most evangelicals in the 50s and 60s were against interracial marriage, and people kind of lose sight of that. In the mid-1970s, evangelicals didn't have any big concern about abortion. So my next evangelical from 1976 was a big Jimmy Carter Democrat supporter and was pro-choice. And then you go forward to evangelicals in most recent history, they define themselves by being pro-life, in utero at least, and anti-gay marriage. And so these sort of boundary markers, they change with each generation. And then people think the boundary marker just is the essence of what it is to be that thing, which yields a very distorted, I would say, understanding of the theology overall.
That's interesting. And you mentioned you debated Frankie Schaeffer, you said? Yeah, that's interesting. I read his book, was it Sex, Mom, and God or something like that? I read the one and I thought it was interesting to see him. This is the son, for those who don't know, this is the son of the famous Christian apologist Francis Schaeffer, who doesn't paint a very nice picture of his dad, but also talks about sort of starting the American culture wars back in the, 70s and 80s. It's kind of interesting. Like, I guess, what am I trying to say here? It seems that the kind of combination of like political extremism and fundamental ideas, I think, are what most people think of when they think of evangelicalism. But you're suggesting, and reading your work too, I can see a lot of breadth in the way that you're engaging with issues and maybe even with what it means to be an evangelical. I'm trying to work around to a question here, but I said this would probably be more of a conversation than an interview. But how do you see, like, one of the things that I think a lot of people, when I make these videos, I'm reacting to evangelicalism. People are reacting to hurt that they, in some cases, hurt that they experienced 40 years ago and they haven't been in a church since. Like, there's a lot of adults walking wounded from some of this stuff. How do you kind of understand that? Like, how do you look at what is now called the Deconstruction movement? We call it this generally now, and there's huge internet followings, people talking about leaving evangelicalism. And like, where do you kind of reconcile, or not reconcile is not the right word, but where do you see that fitting within this kind of moment we're at right now with evangelicalism?
Well, so the Reformation had this Latin phrase, semper reformanda, the idea being that the church is always reforming. The church should always be reforming, because the church just is a collection of human beings who are in constant need of sanctification or the journey toward holiness. So as we as individuals need to move and change in that journey toward holiness, so the collective, the community does as well. And that means the community in each new generation needs to deconstruct and to reconstruct. That's just part of what it is to be a Christian. That's part of what it is to see now darkly as through a glass. That's part of what it is to learn how to love God and one's neighbor. And that means that potentially any potential theology, community that you're a part of now may be in need of some radical deconstruction. And I certainly think that's the case with modern evangelicalism. I think that, I'd like to go back to getting dated now, but in 1997, Philip Yancey published a book, What's So Amazing About Grace, and he talked about how he would ask everybody that he would meet, what's the first associations they would have when they heard the word evangelical. And everything that people associated evangelical with was negative. It was all about judgment. It was about being against gay people and against pornography and against abortion, pretty much. And there's nothing about loving your neighbor, right? Nothing about caring for the earth, nothing about showing compassion to animals and all sentient life, nothing about a comprehensive understanding of community and wellness and goodness and benevolence and spiritual fruit. All of that was completely absent. And I'd say it's a lot worse today than it was in the mid-1990s. So I understand why people have the cynicism. And the cynicism comes certainly from different areas. I mean, I said that I investigate abuse in churches now, so I see firsthand what can happen and the kind of abuse that can follow from the cover-ups and often the patriarchal context and the misuse of Matthew 18 about confronting your brother. Well, what if your brother is sexually abusing you or a bully who's domineering you? You're really expected to go to that person. And you see how all of these things perpetuate cycles of abuse. And then you add onto that a layer of theological doctrines, which can themselves be very abusive in nature in the way they're presented, like the fear of the afterlife and hell and coming judgment. And growing up fearing the rapture, waking up from having a nap once and thinking everybody had been raptured but me, and running through the house looking for anybody else. Those kinds of things stay with you. And so I understand why people have a lot of skeletons in their closet and why there's a lot of animosity towards some of these theologies.
I wonder too if like one of the things that I found really constricting was the kind of anti-intellectualism. Like I know I've heard you mention in a few of your talks the book by Mark Knoll, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And I remember coming across that book in seminary when I was going to look for kind of intellectual responses to what I was encountering in seminary, which was not coming from atheists, contrary to what a lot of people think about going to an Anglican seminary. It was just different parts of the Christian tradition that didn't sit right with me, the development of theology, development of the canon, for example, things like that. And the best I was coming across were from this kind of Christian apologetics movement, people like, why am I blanking on his name? Josh McDowell, things like that. Case for Christ, stuff that I think to somebody who doesn't know anything about biblical studies or, the development of theology or whatever, I think those provide a certain kind of answer for people who don't actually know any better, but they really seem to fall flat. So I found what I was looking for and what I couldn't find in evangelicalism was a genuine ability to be thoughtful, like an actual ability to engage intellectually with a tradition without feeling like I was stepping out of bounds in some way.
Sorry, I got distracted by one of my dogs demanding to be picked up. But
that's right.
Yeah,
you want to repeat it or?
No. Well, I've got where you're going. So I grew up in that space with Josh McDowell and that, and later on, the Case for Christ, Lee Strobel, and they're very much what I would say is, it's in terms of confirmation bias, a one-sided case-building process where you only show one side and the evidence that favors your view. And in terms of I would say, though, again, like a lot of these problems have become even bigger today. So in terms of the anti-intellectualism, which is always, evangelicalism, of course, arose as a modern movement in the early 1940s as a reaction to fundamentalism and a desire to return sort of more conservative, traditional Christianity. Although I say traditional because, of course, it's their understanding of what they thought was an earlier form, but it's still 20th century Christianity. This is a bit of, pardon the cul-de-sac here. I'll get back onto the tangent, but fundamentalists, and that, interestingly, I mean, they say that they're like pre-modern and orthodox and that, but there's this obsession nonetheless with trying to validate Christianity with respect to science, although now it becomes creation science.
Yeah.
So this need to validate it with respect to an external authority of science, and that is a very much of a modernistic obsession. So ironically, they think they're just maintaining the grand old tradition of orthodoxy, but they're separated at some distance from it. Evangelicalism in the 20th century, I think, is similar to that. But they started off, nonetheless, trying to be intellectual. Carl Henry helping to found evangelicalism, the National Association of Evangelicalism, the founding of Christianity Today, Fuller Theological Seminary, all of these bastions of a new intellectual credibility. But that has gradually eroded. In the 1950s and 60s, Christianity Today, for example, was close to being an academic journal. It was like First Things. And then it gradually devolved, not to pick on it, but it's just become more of a magazine like Time or whatever. Much more serious, I think, is the general abandonment culturally of expertise. So again, you get into the rejection of science, which used to be just the thing fundamentalists did, but now increasingly evangelicals are doing, even down to things like vaccines and trusting vote counts. And that's where we're at. So it's a pretty dark place to be.
I find that with the place that I get this is with biblical scholarship, because people don't really trust biblical scholars, and it's difficult to. I did a video a few weeks back, but I was talking about are there really liberal and conservative biblical scholars? And you feel free to push back on any of this if you disagree with me. But what I found is that I think a lot of the apologists I've engaged with have first of all, created this kind of boogeyman of like the liberal scholar. And I know you mentioned this in one of your books, but this the philosophy professor from God's Not Dead, the one who is just out to destroy you because he was hurt and has daddy issues or something, So there's sort of this like liberals who are secretly angry at God. But what I find it too is just a serious attempt to discredit like good biblical scholars. I'll take Bart Ehrman as example. Like Bart Ehrman is a bit of a sensationalist sometimes, but he is actually a really good biblical scholar. And most of the stuff that he talks about is well within the realms of the norms of biblical scholarship, including a lot of what you would even find in, evangelical seminaries. So I wonder how, like it seems that when you talk about expertise, I wonder if there's even room for certain kinds of expertise in the way that evangelicalism thinks right now, because it seems that when you're kind of your whole desire is to defend the status quo and not push, and especially driven by this doctrine of an inerrant Bible, I don't know how, like, I don't even know how to engage with evangelicals about the Bible per se, because it's just like guards up, we have to attack, this guy's a liberal. And it's like, it's just hard, you know what I mean? Like, it's just hard to even have conversations about the Bible with people who have already decided you're the boogeyman just because you don't believe, just because you don't fit, or you don't kind of restate the things that they've always believed about the Bible. Like any kind of push, any kind of challenge is an attack. Is that a fair assessment? Is that what you see? Or
yeah, I mean, let me say with Bart Ehrman, I appreciate what you said. I think he's an excellent biblical scholar. I also think he kind of veers toward the sensational. So, for example, I remember him back with misquoting Jesus. I think it was where he made this comment about how there are more variant readings between texts in the early centuries of the church than there are verses in the New Testament or something like that.
Yeah, I do remember that.
Which is just very misleading, because, of course you're going to get that if you have that many texts. You have like 15,000 Greek and Latin texts or manuscripts, whatever, then you're going to end up with variant readings. It's misleading. And then things I don't like his account of his philosophy behind miracles in history. But for the most part, I've read his books and found that to be very beneficial. And bottom line is this: one of the things that's really frustrating about evangelicalism is this idea of where it has to be all or nothing. So again, this very binary inner out-group thinking. And so it's like, don't read Bart Ehrman, you can't learn anything from that. Well, nobody's perfect. Bart Ehrman's not perfect, but there's a lot of good stuff in those books that'll get you thinking. And why not just equip people like that to be able to be discerning, critical readers, rather than to get people into thinking, we don't read Bart Ehrman, we read Gary Habermas and N.T. Wright or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So you end up Yeah, you end up with the good scholars and the bad scholars, rather than to realize everybody has a point of view. There's no theology, no biblical studies without presuppositions, assumptions. And it's all provisional in nature, but we don't have to get into that sort of ideological mindset. So it can be frustrating.
Yeah, for sure. Do you think, does apologetics fit within that? Like, where does, coming back to the Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, which was an interesting book when I read it, and I know you've mentioned it a few times. Is that still kind of an accurate assessment? Would you say that Mark Noll's kind of main thesis, to put it kind of bluntly, I think, is that there isn't much of an evangelical mind, that there isn't really this life of the mind intellectual tradition in evangelicalism. Is that fair to say? Is apologetics kind of evidence of that, or?
Well, so first of all, that book's getting old now. It's over 30 years old. Yeah. But I still think it's very much on point. Again, I think that these problems are even in some respects more significant now. Now, things have improved in some ways. So, for example, since that book was written, you've seen the rise, let's say, of Biologos, which seeks to be an evangelical organization that brings neo-Darwinian evolution, science more generally, and a healthy attitude to science, and introduces it to evangelicals, so they're not left thinking the only game in town is young or older creationists. And there are things that are happening like that that are good, and that they're populated by top-tier scholars. But I can think of several scholars who began evangelical and ended up becoming Catholic or Orthodox over time. And I think it's something probably just of the frustrations of dealing, this is my own armchair psychologizing, but dealing with the frustrations of evangelical subculture. And the fact that often you are in danger of stepping on toes. And I mean, who wants to be, I know one friend who was hired as a biblical scholar at a Christian university in the US, conservative evangelical, but one that they had a lot of funding and they really wanted to become more intellectually recognized in the landscape, kind of like a junior Baylor University or something like that. They were working toward that. But in the first year that they hired this guy who was a biblical scholar, he was actually fired by the board because they found out he had criticized younger creationism. So you've got like the administration wanted to go in one direction and the board wanted to go in another. And eventually what tends to win out in those struggles is the conservative impulse. So I think it's difficult, and there hasn't been as much progress as I would have hoped.
It's just like a cautious impulse, or like a desire to protect rather than risk, or that's kind of what it?
Yeah, I think sometimes, the old expression, sometimes it's darkest before dawn. So sometimes the biggest fights occur right before there's a major paradigm shift or change. So it's hard for me to envision that evangelicals are still going to be exercised about something like evolution in another 20 years.
Yeah,
but I could be wrong.
Yeah.
I also think so with gay marriage and same-sex relationships. It was significant. So one of the things I pointed out in the book when I'm talking about the culture shift that I do think is happening in evangelicalism, it is there that Zondervan published a book in their Counterpoint series 9 years ago on gay marriage, where they had Christian scholars arguing on both sides of the debate of gay marriage. The very fact that an evangelical conservative publisher would publish a book like that told me that something is changing in evangelicalism. Maybe not as quickly as I might like, but it is changing. So yeah, we'll see what happens in another 20 years. Who knows? Maybe one more thing. As I'm thinking back around the turn of the century, so around the year 2000, one of my former teachers, Stanley Granz, published a book where he saw at that time evangelicalism going into two different directions. One that would be increasingly conservative and one that would be increasingly progressive, quote unquote, liberal. And I think that that's been borne out. I think that what you have seen is some evangelicals have retrenched into a more conservative trajectory, much like the Southern Baptists have in the last 30 years. And then others have gone into a more progressive direction. Again, some of them leaving evangelicalism altogether. Others kind of rebranding themselves as progressive Christian or something else.
Could we talk about the label progressive Christian? I was reading through, I think I got about halfway through. I didn't have time to read quite the whole thing. Your response to Elisa Childers, I think is her name. I see her channel and I've watched a couple of her videos, but I get a little triggered, so I have to turn them off. But I mean, I consider myself a progressive Christian, but I'm probably I prefer the term liberal Christian because it's that like I already mentioned, the kind of liberal movement that I kind of associate with, including the freedom that brought to biblical studies, notwithstanding the terrible things that it wrought in Germany. But that's kind of where I like to hang out. But I think even what I talk about on my channel is, for me, as I know you said this in one of your books too, I haven't had the gift of faith in quite a while. It's been much more just I don't use the word cultural Christianity either, but for me, studying religion, I did a religious studies PhD. So my PhD was Christian origins, but in a religious studies department. I found studying religion a way for me to identify as a Christian again, because it's basically my way of being human. So I know I'm like in some ways beyond the pale of even a lot of progressives, but I think there are a lot of people who kind of two things. There are people who find progressive Christianity, and that's great. And I think there are a lot of people who don't find progressive Christianity or any other form of Christianity, because I think so many people are predisposed to think Christianity means believing in an inerrant Bible, or Christianity means, X, like this thing about the doctrine of the atonement, and then all of a sudden when people leave that, they think the next stop is atheism. I wonder what it is that we're missing, because when I read your work, I see a deep engagement with all sorts of theological traditions that I engaged with in seminary as well. I don't think people know about this. Like, I don't think people know about the depths and the richness of the Christian tradition, when you're kind of trained with this tunnel vision to just see it as like, you have to believe substitutionary atonement, inerrant Bible, 6,000-year-old earth, maybe things like that. How do you kind of engage with that? I don't know. Is that a fair assessment of what we're missing? I don't know. I'll just throw that. That's not even a question, but I'll throw that out to you.
Well, I'm gonna focus in on one little bit of what you just mentioned. You mentioned the next stop is atheism. I would say in some respects, so what? So let me unpack what that means. So growing up in the conservative evangelical tradition, atheism is presented as the antithesis of light, and this is darkness.
Yeah, fair.
It's evil. And then there's all these, frankly, lies that are spread about atheists and atheist community. So, for example, that they're all moral nihilists. They have no basis to have morality, which is just patently false. And you even have people like William Lane Craig, who's probably the most well-known apologist of the last 40 years. That is one of his central claims for decades, is that atheism is just nihilism and has no basis for objective morality, when in fact most atheist philosophers are moral realists. They have an objective account of moral value and obligation. You may not find it satisfactory, but they're not moral nihilists or moral relativists either. So that's the first thing to recognize. But then I would say, so there are, in my book, The Doubter's Creed, I give examples of atheists who believe in ultimate reality and are open, sort of believe in an ultimate reality greater than nature, which is a source of all goodness, but they don't believe in some personal God. So Ronald Dworkin explores this idea, and J.L. Schellenberg, who's one of the leading atheist philosophers in the world today and a Canadian, open to that kind of project. And Eric Wielenberg as well. So these are people who would say, yeah, I'm an atheist, but I believe that there is this absolute source of the good or absolute standard of goodness out there which transcends nature. And I'm just going to they would say something like, I seek to live my life in accord with that, maybe, which is like productive of the kind of things that Christians would look upon very positively, like the love of neighbor. And my question then is this: if a person has that sort of theological framework, that orientation of reality, and is trying to live that out in the love of their neighbor as themselves, which is absolutely one of the two core teachings Jesus gave us. So they have that teaching, the loving the neighbor as themselves. And in terms of loving God, to some degree, you'd say, well, you say it's not God. You say you're an atheist, but I would say maybe that very thing you are talking about is God. But you've got a partial description, and I've got a partial description. And what you do is you begin to break down the absolute binary contrast between these two options. And you begin to say, man, maybe God's actually doing something amazing in their life as they are seeking to love their neighbor as themselves and orienting themselves to the standard of goodness. And so when you begin to think in those terms, I think it makes the world so much more interesting, because it's not like you don't go over there, that's bad. You have to be here or you're going to go to hell. But rather to appreciate how, from a Christian perspective, God's presence and love is to be found in all of these places. And to the degree that you are moving into the conformity of your love of neighbor, maybe you are on that path that I would affirm as a God-centered, Christ-centered path.
That's really cool. You talk about in the book somebody like Greta, what's her name? Is it Vospers? She's a Canadian United Church priest who came out as an atheist. And you talk about people like Marcus Borg. And so you do talk a little bit about like different spectrums of progressive Christianity. But I guess for somebody wanting to stay within the Christian tradition, like, could you talk a bit to what, even like whether it's within evangelicalism, maybe in one of these more progressive communities that you're talking about, some people are going to stay in conservative communities and keep their mouths shut because they need to be there. Some people are going to move out into other Christian communities. But can you talk a little bit about the kind of depth of the kind of vastness of the Christian tradition, different experiences, and where I think like the thing that I thought was really interesting from the book is you're kind of talking about like what's non-negotiable and there's not much, it sounds like, this non-negotiable from kind of your reading of progressive Christianity. Is that a fair assessment? Can you talk a bit about that? Or
well, I don't even know what non-negotiable means. Like, according to whom?
Fair.
According to some ecclesial body, according to a standard of what it is required to be saved. So, and those are, by the way, are commonly the two major categories people are working with. Either is this non-negotiable to be counted as part of this community according to some human institution, versus is this what is the minimum that is required in order to be saved? And so I'm kind of cautious about both of those labels. So yeah, I think it's a little complicated. I mean, I would say just in terms of the term progressive Christianity, so it has two general different uses. And the one use, so there's a website, Progressive Christianity, I think it's .org. And it was founded by John Shelby Spong, where he came up with like a list of, the 10 dictates of progressive Christianity or something like that, his sort of working creed. And he's coming out of what I would say is a more mainline liberal tradition. The other one is the use of progressive Christian, which is appropriated by people who often are ex-evangelical. They've come out of the evangelical tradition, feel somewhat alienated by that, and they've latched onto this term. 20 years ago, they were often called emergent and emerging Christians. Yeah. They were also for a little while called new kind of Christian with Brian McLaren stuff.
I interviewed Brian McLaren on the channel, so I can link his interview below. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so those are there's a commonality there, but there's also a lot of difference in terms of cultural background between the Spongs and then those that are coming out of the Brian McLaren side.
Yeah, so that makes sense.
McLaren had a Plymouth Brethren origin too.
Yeah, he did too.
Yeah. So it always, as with all terms, ask people what they mean when they call themselves a progressive Christian. Now, this is the one thing I'll say is that, so often evangelicals will say, well, progressive Christianity doesn't mean anything at all because you can find anybody who will claim to be a progressive Christian. By the way, I use that tone of voice when I'm criticizing somebody, just to let everybody know.
In case it wasn't obvious. Yeah.
But I just put up the evangelical functions the same way, because you can find everybody who is complementarian cessationist, non-charismatic, who's evangelical, identifies as an evangelical, to a radical egalitarian, non-cessationist, charismatic. Everybody's using the term evangelical. It has as much a diverse usage as the term progressive Christian. Mm-hmm. So for all of these terms, if a person identifies themselves in a particular way, just ask them what they mean by it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I get a lot of, Well, let me ask this. Like, what would you say to somebody who does think that the next stop is atheism? You gave a really nice response there for kind of even some of the diversity of that, and you say, so what? Do you have some advice for like reconnecting or exploring Christian tradition? Is there a couple books you would recommend? Is there a way to kind of for people who can't go to seminary, presumably don't have the options necessarily to explore this rich tradition? What would your advice be to somebody like that? Where would they go?
That's always really tough to as just like, well, here's a book about it. But let me just give one big thing I think that is a significant problem in my estimation for what sets people up to failure, is that they're taught as a Christian in this conservative evangelical tradition that to be a Christian just is to believe in this story of God acting in history from Adam and the creation of the world in 6 days straight through to the book of Revelation and a lake of fire, and to think of all of in heaven tossed in the New Jerusalem, but all of this as one historical narrative to which you're committed. And the interesting thing is, and I was really focused in on this when I was writing my book on the Canaanite genocide, Jesus Loves Canaanites, is that really the heart of Christianity has always been the Apostles' Creed, Nicene Creed, centering on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So for me, for my mind, the starting point is Jesus, who he was, what he did, and are you living in conformity to him? Not was there a historical exodus? Was there a global flood? Was there a 6-day creation? These are the kinds of things, is there historical evidence for King David? Having all of these things be the things on which your faith rests makes that faith incredibly vulnerable. And it's vulnerable, of course, to history and to archaeology and to textual criticism, but it's also vulnerable to all the moral objections that come with thinking God was just literally commanding all the things that God is described as doing and commanding in the Bible. It's scientific problems and on and on and on. So to recognize, really know the heart of Christian faith is Jesus. In one sense, wasn't that always the right answer in Sunday school, was Jesus? And yet somehow we forgot that, and we thought, no, we have to be as committed to all of these other things, thinking it's all part of historical narrative that we have to defend and have to have the apologetic resources to defend, or the whole thing crumbles. You mentioned Bart Ehrman. I mean, he tells that story himself of growing up in a fundamentalist background and feeling the weight of having to reconcile Jesus appearing thing in Mark chapter 2, I forget where it was, where he gets the priest wrong. When David took the bread and Jesus referred to that instance, and he got the priest wrong.
I don't actually know the reference offhand, but yeah.
Bart Ehrman wrote like a 40-page paper about explaining how this really wasn't a contradiction, or Jesus or the Gospel of Mark didn't get it wrong. And then he said that his prof wrote a single question. He's like, well, why not just say you got it wrong or something? And that kind of just swept away all his arguments. And that shows the vulnerability of that kind of fundamentalist mindset in approaching the Bible.
It's hard. Like, I feel, because my background is a biblical scholar and I'm trying to talk about biblical scholarship on YouTube, it does feel like I'm attacking people sometimes. I'm not trying to. I'm not. I think there is a little bit. I mean, I'm always kind of assessing what I'm trying to do. But if for example, I'm giving an example of here's a biblical contradiction, I don't say that to say, aha, and that's why the Bible's wrong and you're an idiot. I hope to say, by acknowledging that this is a contradiction, maybe we can come to see the Bible differently. Maybe we can come to read it differently. But I find it challenging. Like, I do find it really difficult because people have such formed opinions, and the people in my comments are like the people with they're most certain that I'm an idiot and they know everything they need to know about the Bible, regardless of whether they're like KJV onlyists or have done a year in seminary. And it's hard to know how to constructively engage as a Bible scholar, I think, because I don't just want to destroy everybody's faith, but at the same time, I don't think we can keep the sort of evangelical knowledge of the Bible where it is. Like, I don't really think that we do justice to ourselves by just letting the apologists have the last word. Be curious to know what you think about that.
So this idea that this idea that all of the writers have to be without error. So often inerrancy is in the background, but it's not defined. I think in the background, what people are typically assuming is human authorial inerrancy, meaning something like the human author is always without error in all of his affirmations, assuming a woman didn't write Hebrews or whatever. Was it Sapphira or Junior or whatever the speculations?
A fair assumption it wasn't a woman.
Yeah.
By ancient literacy statistics. Yeah.
So whatever the human author affirms is something we should affirm as well. And that, of course, it's easy to pick holes in that. I mean, that is, but that old, if you're really committed to something, you're really committed to thinking the truth and authority of the text resides in this view. And then if you're given bad arguments to think, well, if God included something false in the text, then God is lying to us, which is often an argument in the background here. It's also can very just shut down any kind of critiques. The other big thing is just to appreciate, or the assumption that evangelicals often have, that the Bible has to be this a text of unanimity, that all of the authors contained therein agree with one another, rather than to recognize that, in fact, disagreement could be part of the whole point. That which one thinks is a bug, that you need the apologist or the appropriately baptized evangelical scholar to explain away, could in fact be a feature if you appreciate maybe these different voices in the text are there for a reason. And the simple example I always give is it's very tough to reconcile the imprecatory psalmist's sentiment about their enemies with Jesus' sentiment about enemies in Matthew 5. So there is often you will find evangelicals, they're trying to explain, well, there are contexts in which you want to curse your enemies and where that's appropriate. No, Jesus told us to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. So for me, the way that I've focused over the years on that as an example to try to get people a new paradigm for thinking how the Bible functions. I say, let's do a deep dive on the imprecatory Psalms, add up all the things the imprecatory psalmist says about their enemies, how they want to bathe their feet in the blood of the wicked. They want their names to be wiped out of the book of life. They want their children to be childless. Blessed is he who takes their babies and dashes them against the rocks. And say, you really can't baptize that. So what are you going to do with it? Well, the other alternative, to put it bluntly, is to say, well, the Psalms are a record of human experience. And sometimes people are hurting and they're pissed off. And the Psalms give that to us. And in fact, that is a mirror of who we often are as well. And so when we read the psalmists as being pissed off like that, we can identify with them. And we should also ask ourselves, what did they experience that led them to say those things? So I give the example from Southern Ontario of Marco Muzo, who was driving his Ferrari early in the morning, coming back from a party drunk, and he drove into a car and killed a grandfather and his 3 grandchildren. And at his hearing, the mother, Jennifer Neville Lake, spoke in a victim impact hearing, and she said to the man who killed her 3 children, you deserve to know what it's like to lose everyone you've ever loved. That's an imprecation in the modern day. Understood in context, it makes perfect sense. It's a mother with her heart cry grieving. And I now read Psalm 137:9, talking about bashing Babylonian babies against the rocks, with the heart cry, anguish, and pain of a person who's been thrown into exile and wants to retribute back 10 times harder to the people that hurt them. And that preaches to me, not because I had to pretend that's in agreement with what Jesus says, but precisely because it contrasts with Jesus says. And that's the beauty and the richness of making the biblical text a living text of living dissonant voices who, read correctly, all call us into the love of God and neighbor.
Okay, so I want to throw a couple of hot takes at you. This is stuff that I've thought a lot about and I've done videos on, and just kind of get your reaction on them. You certainly don't have to agree with me. I'm not actually expecting that you will agree with me necessarily, but I'd be curious to hear some of your thoughts on these. So one of the things that we were sort of just talking about in our last question, we were talking about how I think you get the sense of like the church's point is not to be about certain doctrines or not to be about, obsessing over the Bible. It's about Jesus. And one of the things that I've critiqued in that view is that with that, the sort of modern approach, and I see it among progressive Christians too, like there's a pushback, like we don't need, this legalism, we just need Jesus. But from my perspective as a biblical scholar, that idea of like what Jesus is so slippery. And the famous Quest for the Historical Jesus, which was critiqued by Albert Schweitzer famously in the early 20th century, I think often people end up just kind of, Jesus is almost like our own reflection, like it's kind of what we think. And for some people, Jesus is kind of a mystic sage, and for others, he's a fundamentalist, and for others, he's a freedom warrior or a social justice warrior or something. Throwing that at you, how would you say we can come to the tradition, even if we're saying like this is ultimately about Jesus? How do we reconcile with the fact that we are all dealing with kind of very different ideas of what Jesus is or who Jesus is?
Well, first of all, let's appreciate that this is just the general human condition, that we all have different presuppositions. Nobody has a God's eye point of view. Nobody sees things as they are without bias or context, right? We're all historical, contextual beings. And of course, we're all going to see Jesus in the light of that. So I had mentioned that, so the starting point historically for Christianity is a particular story which is encapsulated in the creeds. Again, the story is about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And so that provides sort of architectonic structure, I think, in which a Christian should live and move and have their being. What does it actually mean on the ground? I think I like to begin with love of neighbor and say, well, what is love of neighbor? Well, let's start off with golden rule, right? This is something that seems pretty secure to me. And I like to always give the illustration when we're getting into these matters of, I live on the Canadian prairies, gets pretty cold in the winter. In the spring, things warm up, the ponds, the ice begins to break up. If you walk out on a pond in late winter, early spring, you're fairly secure near shore. The further out you get, the thinner the ice gets, the less sure you are, the less likely you are to walk out there, right? Because of the increased risk. And I like to think about the doctrines we're talking about here in a similar manner. It's like when you're close to the shore, you're right almost on the shore. This is like love of neighbor. If you want to get way out onto the ice, then you're talking about does the Spirit proceed from the Father and the Son? And that's something I think that we should have a lot less conviction about. And too often in history, people wanted to place all their weight on very thin doctrinal ice. And it's unwise. So I think let's start off with, what does it mean to love your neighbor? Some years ago, I gave an illustration that I've often come back to. So during the Rwandan genocide, I give two different responses to it. One of the responses was from a fellow named Mabaye Diagne, who was working with the UN peacekeeping forces under the Canadian General Romeo Dallaire in Kigali. And every day he would defy orders and leave what colloquially was known as Hotel Rwanda, where they were based. And he would go out and he would rescue Tutsis in the streets, put them into his Land Rover, and then drive them back through multiple Hutu checkpoints, bargaining with cigarettes and using jokes in order to get them through. And he risked his life every day, and he saved dozens of people until he was blown up by shrapnel in late May of 1994. That's the first. The second response to the genocide was Elizabeth Nikatarama, who was a Seventh-day Adventist pastor, who himself was Hutu, the dominant ethnic group that was carrying out the genocide. And when some of his congregants who were Tutsi reached out to him pleading for help while they were in hiding, he actually sent the Hutu militias in to slaughter them. I always say to people, you have the choice in the thought experiment to take the life and legacy of Mabaye Diagne, who was Muslim and risked his life every day to save his fellow neighbors, or the Christian who in fact was complicit in genocide. If you're going to stand before the throne of God, which would you choose? Sometimes I'll get people say, well, it's a false dichotomy. It's not a false dichotomy. It's a thought experiment, which is comparing two relative values. By analogy, I can also ask you, if you were stranded in the woods, would you rather have a compass or a Bowie knife? Don't say it's a false analogy. The point is you're comparing which of these two things is of more value, the compass or the Bowie knife when you're lost in the woods. Similarly, my thought experiment is, which is ultimately more important for being rightly related with the ultimate source of all reality? Is it to have the right set of doctrines and be complicit in genocide? Or is it on a Christian measure to have a wrong set of doctrines, but actually have loved your neighbor? And honestly, I think there's maybe one person in 12, 15 years that I've been asking this question who has said clearly that they would rather be the genocidaire who believe Christian doctrine. Virtually everybody either refuses to answer, or they all say they would rather be the Muslim. Talking about Christians, I'm asking, of course. Mm-hmm. And so for me, this is a way of centering what my ultimate convictions are. I think theology is important. I'm a systematic theologian by training. But if I'm not loving my neighbor, as Paul said, that's a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal.
I love that. Sounds very similar to an analogy about a certain Samaritan that Jesus gave as well. So that's cool. Second kind of hot seat question that I'll throw at you. We talked a little bit in this conversation about, I can't remember if you mentioned prophecy or miracles, but one of the things that I find as a historian is that often I get pushback, coming back to the whole idea of like liberal versus conservative scholars. One of the things that I will see is people will say, well, conservative scholar, for example, is somebody who will be open to the possibility of, let's say, prophecy. This is fresh in my mind. And they'll say, for example, the book of Daniel, like, liberals want to date it into the Maccabean period. Conservatives might want to date it, into the time of the Babylonians. And they'll say the reason why you're a liberal scholar is because you won't consider prophecy as a possibility in history, whereas a conservative will. My answer to that is that scholar is not actually considering prophecy as a general kind of historical method. They're not looking at the Sibylline oracles or at the Oracle of Delphi and saying, like, these are prophetic statements. We should judge all history based on prophecy. It actually just turns into special pleading for, like, the book that I already think is inerrant, and that prophecy becomes a way of kind of explaining it. So the thing that I contend, and coming back, I know you mentioned, we talked a bit about Bart Ehrman, but the thing that I'm kind of playing around with is the idea that really I think the liberal and conservative dichotomy is kind of a false one. And really, I think there's just, will scholars genuinely engage with the question or not? And if I'm looking at the resurrection, for example, as a historian, I might say, well, dead bodies don't necessarily resuscitate. That's not a historical claim. That's going to be a faith claim. Anyway, throwing that at you, I'd be curious to hear your reactions to that.
It's funny, coming from a conservative evangelical background, how much focus was on Daniel, obviously in part because it played a key role in being a prophetic key for a lot of these dispensational schemas.
Yeah.
But also for this reason that you're talking about, that it was sort of seen as this prophecy talking about ancient Near Eastern history and the rise and fall of all these kingdoms, which came after Daniel, which attests to the authority then of the text, which then all gets undermined if you're saying that this is actually retrospective from the perspective of the Maccabean period. So another interesting example of that is, so where do you date Mark? And I remember, like, from within that evangelical subculture saying, well, the libs date Mark to, post 70 AD because Jesus in Mark 13 has this prophecy about the destruction of Jerusalem. And they assume, of course, that couldn't be a genuine prophecy, so it has to have been after the fall of Jerusalem. And that could be a factor in some people's thinking. There's a sort of anti-supernatural bias. But I would just want to say to the conservative evangelicals and others, why don't you also keep an open mind and look for the evidence that this actually does make the most sense having been written after 70 AD, or that Daniel does make the most sense in the Maccabean period. These are, to my mind, they become, again, some of these minor issues that people end up majoring on. And one way that this functions then is to poison the well against this other group by saying, well, they're really just everything that every way that they're approaching the text is from their anti-supernatural bias. So we can kind of dismiss all the things that they have to say. And I just wish that conservatives were a little more judicious about, again, saying, what can I learn from these people? And maybe actually 2 Peter is best explained as a text that wasn't written by Peter, maybe was written in the 2nd century. Just keep an open mind. And if your faith collapses on that point, again, I would ask, is that the faith of the Apostles' Creed, or is that the faith that there can be no pseudepigrapha in the New Testament? Because those are, in a sense, two very different faiths.
Interesting. Is everyone an apologist? I had this, William Lane Craig responded to one of my videos once, and basically I had said in the video talking about how much I hate apologetics. He kind of said, well, everyone's an apologist. Everyone, wants to defend their beliefs. And the thing that I think I've encountered with Christian apologetics is that's often a way of trying to level the playing field so that Christian apologetics can be treated as equal to actual scholarship, so that my presuppositions are the same as your actual scholarly inquiry because everyone's an apologist. Reactions to that? Be curious.
Well, I find myself kind of in between you and Craig on that. I would think somebody like Richard Bauckham or N.T. Wright, they're doing great scholarship from a more conservative lens, and they're contributing to the conversation just as more progressive or liberal scholars are. And I would say everybody does have, again, a perspective, an agenda, a set of assumptions, just like, and everybody is acting as an apologist in one sense, that they are seeking to persuade others of their point of view. But I think it's sort of, we just have to appreciate the degree to which an external set of ideological commitments that are held by a belief community can become a constraint or a procrustean bed on the kind of research a person is allowed to do. And actually, in terms of my present work as a workplace investigator, this leads into a topic that I think is really important and underappreciated, which is psychological safety. So within a healthy, safe community, when people have psychological safety, they are free to express questions, doubts, and disagreements. But if you lack psychological safety, you keep your questions, doubts, and disagreements to yourself. I should also add your mistakes. If you're psychologically safe, you're free to share your mistakes without fear of reprisal or social censure, but not if you lack that safety. And a lot of people grow up in conservative churches that lack psychological safety because they're taught to fear, they're taught to keep their questions and doubts to themselves. And if you end up being then years later a scholar at an evangelical seminary or a Christian university where you have to worry about what the board or the constituency is going to say, and you're constantly walking on eggshells, don't tell me that isn't going to affect your scholarship. It is true, however, again, that can happen anywhere. So you could, I think as you would know, coming from an academic background, you could be at a public university and there's still this sort of joke that you don't ask some of the more provocative questions until you have tenure.
Yeah.
So it can happen anywhere. But I think we all need to appreciate, and certainly Christian conservatives need to appreciate, the degree to which these external constraints can really be a stranglehold on the kind of scholarship they can pursue and could end up distorting the way that they approach the topics they're addressing.
One of the, this is rapid fire, so these are not necessarily in any order, but one of the things I get a lot of pushback is on the idea that inerrancy is a modern idea. And I think a lot of, some people just have no idea and think inerrancy has always been around. And then there are others who kind of want to trace the genesis of inerrancy as if it's always been kind of implied through church history. How do you respond to that? Where do you see inerrancy fitting within modern? Is it a modern idea? Do you agree with that? What do you make of that?
One thing I would want to highlight here is that up until the Reformation era, it was very common to have something like a quadriga approach to the text, where there are 3 or 4 different meanings, including a literal meaning of the text, but there's also spiritual and eschatological and moral meanings to the text. And what that did was it allowed the text to function in multiple different ways. So you weren't placing all your weight on having to defend what the literal meaning is, because you could end up saying you have doubts or questions about that literal meaning, but still appreciating the text is functioning in these different ways and thus has authority. And so you'd have somebody like Origen who could raise moral objections and questions about the Canaanite genocide, for example, and give nonetheless these spiritualized readings of it, which could address some of those concerns and objections. But when Protestants rejected those other different meanings of the text and placed it all at what is the historical grammatical meaning for the original author, then I think one of the impulses of that was to have this inordinate emphasis upon defending the validity of the statement literally taken from the sensus literalis or whatever the original human author was saying, which then is a distortion and becomes the sort of modern sense of inerrancy. Now, the text had a function in terms of the atomistic value vis-a-vis plenary inspiration throughout the medieval and patristic eras, But it changed, I think, in the modern era because of all that emphasis placed upon historical grammatical meanings of the text. So I think it is important, in important ways different.
Final question. I know we're running out of time, but do you get a lot of pushback from evangelicals? I find like I've really enjoyed engaging with your ideas, and I hope it's not just because I'm a heretic and so are you. But I think I find like I've really enjoyed reading your books, listening to your talks. But I imagine you must get a lot of heat from some evangelicals, maybe some wanting to even place you outside of the fold. How has that been?
Yeah, when I was a seminary professor for 20 years, you would regularly get people in the constituency who would chirp about whatever a particular seminary professor was saying. I suspect that most of the faculty at some point or another were a target, and certainly I was a target at different points. I also was a target from colleagues. And so even my tenure process took a couple of years when that happened. It was like 15 years ago, in part because of opposition from colleagues about some things that I had spoken on. I was never, by the way, one to withhold opinions until getting tenure. So like I was publishing a critique of Paul Copan on biblical violence and Philosophia Christi before I ever had tenure, and taking what some would view as a pretty provocative stance. So that goes with the territory. I've also had people reach out to my church, including like randos from the US calling my church on the phone in Canada and saying, this person needs to be disciplined. Like, what are you talking about? So you have to have the skin of a rhino, right? You have to be a little thick-skinned about that, and to recognize the risk that there were times in my academic career when this did create questions about, what is the future of your employment? Could this become an issue? I was fortunately, I think, at a pretty safe place, but I know a lot of people who aren't, and they do have to walk a fine line because of getting targeted.
Do you see a future of a kind of kinder, gentler evangelicalism, of the type that you're espousing, more thoughtful evangelicalism, maybe the restoration of the evangelical mind, or do you feel a bit more like kind of a lone voice?
Well, this goes back maybe to the thing Stan Grenz talked about that I referenced earlier of a split in evangelicalism that he saw happening in the late 1990s. I think that it's continuing now, and I don't know what that's going to mean in the future for Christian expression. I do think that, like MAGA Christianity in the U.S., evangelical Christianity has become so distorted in the U.S. in terms of its affiliation with guns, its affiliation with a lecherous, adjudicated sexual abuser and felon, who yesterday, from where we were recording, did a speech at the Museum of the Bible. And then in the afternoon, the Epstein book came out, which had his lecherous comment to Epstein in there. And you couldn't get a greater contrast between two books, the Bible and the Epstein book, which really captures the moral compromise of contemporary American evangelicalism. And even now, Donald Trump is selling a new Bible. He's made $1.5 million off selling his own branded Bible last year. He's got a new one out for $100. So he's going to continue to make money off of it. I mean, the grift is beyond the pale. And I've seen evangelical scholars, people like Mike Licona, who I once respected, I can't respect anymore because they're all in on MAGA. And I think that has really been a stain on the evangelical landscape, and it's impacting Canada too.
Yes.
Not as much, but I'm seeing it definitely in conservative parts of Alberta, the impact of the Make Alberta Great Again kind of American equivalent. And that is increasingly alien to what I would recognize as any kind of Orthodox Christianity.
Wow. Well, I hope that you're not just an outlier, but I hope that there are many more like you. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Where can people find you online or your books?
Oh, well, yeah, just almighty Google. I say you can just Google my name. Enough books, of course, are available at fine bookstores everywhere as long as it's Amazon. And you can find my YouTube channel online, and I have a website as well. I don't blog there regularly anymore. I used to.
Okay,
But it's been great though, Chris. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I was going to say thank you for doing this, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
You bet. All right, we'll do it.
All right.